Hello, and welcome to A Perspective on Crime, a podcast that explores contemporary research in criminology. One of those films that'll always stick with me is 5 Minutes to Heaven. It's fictional drama which tells of the heartbreaking attempts at reconciliation between a former paramilitary killer, played by Liam Neeson, and the brother of his victim, played by James Nesbitt. In it, the pair grapple with the possibility of finding truth, accountability and healing decades after a sectarian murder during the Northern Ireland Troubles. Though it takes place in Belfast, I was reminded of it when I read a recent paper that focuses its attention 100 miles south, in an affluent South Dublin suburb and the prestigious Blackrock College. The work in question delves into a deeply challenging but vital topic: the long and complex path to justice for survivors of institutional child abuse, into how institutions respond when historical scandals come to light, and whether the tools they use are truly designed for healing. Authored by David O'Mahony and Michelle Butler, the work is entitled Empowering Victims, Survivors, or Restorative Washing, Institutional and Clerical Sexual Abuse of School Children and Restorative Justice, and was published in the British Journal of Criminology. The catalyst for the research was a 2022 Irish television documentary called Blackrock Boys. It detailed the horrific abuse suffered by two brothers at Blackrock College back in the 70s and 80s, and its broadcast provoked a massive public outcry. It's that outcry that leads us to the central question O'Mahony and Butler investigate. Can restorative justice, a process designed for healing and repair, be effectively used by large institutions responding to historical abuse? Or does it simply risk becoming a tool to tidily clean up its public image? To understand the author's argument, we first need to look at the specific events that followed the documentary's broadcast. In their work, the authors are clear to point out that the Blackrock Boys scandal is particularly noteworthy because, unlike many cases of institutional abuse in Ireland, this one involved an elite, private, fee-paying school. As such, the scandal spoke directly to the powerful middle and upper classes of Irish society, and because of that, they state it explains the scale and intensity of the public reaction. Following the documentary, there was a flood of similar revelations from past pupils, which contributed to growing public pressure on the religious order responsible for the school, known as the Spiritans. In response, on November the 16th, 2022, they issued a public apology. But they also did something else. They simultaneously offered all past pupils who'd been abused the opportunity to participate in a restorative justice process. The scale of the abuse that the process was intended to address was staggering. The documentary initially revealed 233 allegations involving 77 Spiritan brothers, and by January of the following year, this had grown to an estimated 400 people alleging they'd been abused, and a further, previously unknown abuser identified. Before we go any further, it's worth pausing on what restorative justice actually means. At its heart, according to the researchers, it's about repairing harm, not just punishing an offence. The formal definition they use describes it as a process whereby all the parties with a stake in a particular offence come together to resolve collectively how to deal with the aftermath of the offence and its implications for the future. The ultimate goal isn't punishment, but to repair harm and empower victims. The specific process offered by the Spiritans was to be voluntary and run by an independent practitioner. The authors explain that the design involved a practitioner working with individuals to prepare them for a potential meeting, not with their abuser, but with representatives of the Spiritans and the school. That's the theory. A process focused on healing and accountability. But the crucial question O'Mahony and Butler ask is whether the specific process the Spiritans put on the table truly lived up to that ideal. And when they dug into the details, they found some serious causes for concern. The authors argue that for restorative justice to be truly effective, especially in cases of severe trauma like child sexual abuse, the process itself is everything. They stress that for any restorative process to work, it must deliver on two key principles: agency, which is about giving survivors real choice and power in the process, and accountability, which is about ensuring offenders take direct responsibility for their actions. Keep those two words, agency and accountability, in mind, because they become crucial to the author's critique. O'Mahony and Butler identified three primary risks in the Spiritans process. The first, and perhaps most significant, is the absence of the perpetrator. The process was specifically designed for cases where the abuser is deceased, so there is no face-to-face meeting between survivors and the individuals who harm them. O'Mahony and Butler see this as a critical flaw. So much of the power of restorative justice, they explain, comes from the direct dialogue between a victim and an offender. The opportunity to have questions answered, to hear an expression of remorse directly, and to hold the person responsible to account. For the authors, this was a fundamental problem. The second risk they highlight is that there was no formal acceptance of responsibility. The authors detail that the Spiritan process does not involve a formal admission of guilt, either by the individual perpetrators or by the institution as a whole. This, they argue, runs directly counter to fundamental restorative principles. The unconditional acceptance of responsibility is seen as an absolute prerequisite for a sincere apology and for any genuine attempt to repair harm. O'Mahony and Butler cite UN guidance which clearly states that restorative justice is for people who accept responsibility for the harm they've caused. The third risk is what the authors describe as a bureaucratic focus. Because the perpetrator is absent from the meetings, the focus necessarily shifts. Instead of being about personal accountability and repair, the process becomes orientated towards institutional concerns, such as identifying systemic failures to avoid it occurring again. O'Mahony and Butler argue that this risks turning a deeply personal, restorative process into a bureaucratic one. Survivors' stories risk being used primarily as data to inform administrative changes, which limits their own sense of agency and empowerment in the process. These limitations led the authors to ask a bigger, more unsettling question. If the process lacks the core components of real restorative justice, what purpose does it actually serve? To answer that question, O'Mahony and Butler propose a new and more powerful concept to understand what might be happening when an institution adopts the language of restorative justice without its substance. They introduce the term restorative washing. To help us understand it, they drew on familiar analogies. Many of us have heard of greenwashing, which is when a company misleads consumers about its environmental practices to appear eco-friendly. Similarly, pinkwashing has been used to describe campaigns that use breast cancer awareness for profit without making a substantive contribution. So, restorative washing, as the authors define it, is the practice of using the language of healing and empowerment to manage a public relations crisis, while the process itself lacks the substance to deliver genuine justice for survivors. With greenwashing, pinkwashing, etc. in mind, This is what makes the author's concept of restorative washing so potent. They detail the Spiritans' documented past behaviour, which includes failing to report abuse, marginalising survivors who came forward, and even funding the legal defence of accused priests, actions which the Spiritans themselves acknowledged had exacerbated the trauma survivors experienced. A 2012 report from the National Board of Safeguarding Children in the Catholic Church in Ireland had already concluded that some of the abuse was preventable and the Spiritans had failed to act appropriately. O'Mahony and Butler argue that when an institution has a documented, decade-long pattern of prioritising its own reputation over the welfare of survivors, any new initiative, no matter how well informed it sounds, must be viewed through a critical lens. Of course, O'Mahony and Butler are careful not to claim this is purely a cynical ploy. As they note, it's possible the Spartans hope to genuinely help survivors and repair their public image simultaneously. But the central warning remains. The primary effect, regardless of intent, risks being reputational repair of the institution, not empowerment of the survivors. The authors warn that its primary effect could be to portray the organisation as taking positive steps, essentially wrapping their limited actions, as they quote, in a veneer of victim empowerment to the wider public. So what's the key message this research tells us? O'Mahony and Butler's paper serves as a powerful call for caution. They urge us to be critical in how restorative justice is applied, especially in complex cases of institutional abuse, and they highlight the absolute importance of core principles like perpetrator accountability and genuine acceptance of responsibility. The authors also make it clear that this is not just a story about one school in Ireland. As similar, heartbreaking scandals of abuse in institutions have been revealed internationally, in countries like Australia, Canada, the United States and across Europe. These questions about institutional accountability and the true meaning of justice are globally significant. Ultimately, the authors leave us with a stark reminder. For justice to be truly restorative, it must be built on a foundation of truth, accountability, and the genuine empowerment of those who have harmed. The research is a clear warning against what they describe as labelling and promoting activities as restorative, particularly if they lack core elements that make restorative justice effective. The paper, which of course I'd encourage you to read for yourself, was Empowering Victims and Survivors or Restorative Washing by David O'Mahony and Michelle Butler, published in the British Journal of Criminology. I've included a direct link to it in the show's notes. There's also a link to a podcast which accompanied the original RTE documentary, The Blackrock Boys. That's in the show notes too. And lastly, should you have a paper, article or chapter you think deserves a platform, or you've read something you think could be of interest to others, please drop me a message. Until next time, goodbye.